CBT Nuggets ITIL Update Series, Service Transition. In this third nugget of the ITIL Update Series, we're going to look at 6 major topics. First of all, we'll get an overview of service transition, the purpose, the goals, the objectives. We'll look at service transition tools. We'll discuss service asset and configuration management, change management, release and deployment management, and then finally, service validation and testing. Let's start out with an overview here, and we'll define exactly what service transition is. Service transition is going to take as its input the service design package, the SDP, and it receives the SDP from the service design phase. Its goal is to make sure that all aspects, all the areas of a service, not just simply the technical aspect, the IT aspect, but all aspects of a service are then transitioned into a real-world operation. That's the goal of service transition, is really transitioning or moving from the strategy and design phase into real-world operation. And of course, that can't happen with the snap of a finger or the blink of an eye. There has to be a transition process. And part of the service transition phase involves things like we can see here: change management, knowledge management, release and deployment management, service and testing validation, and the configuration management system. Now, to use a real-world example, let's say as a service provider we are offering some new security services to our customer as they leverage the internet using their broadband connections from their branch offices. Let's say it's an insurance company with lots of satellite offices or remote offices, and they've been using some older frame relay connections with some older point-to-point tunneling protocol connections. But we're going to transition them into a new implementation, for example, going to a web VPN or SSL VPN solution. Or perhaps we're going to transition them from a legacy IPsec implementation to a Cisco Get VPN implementation. The bottom line is this: the output or the result of our service transition is going to be several things. It's going to be the service transition plan, and again, it goes back to the concept of going from strategy and design into operation or production. There's a transition period. There's a transition phase and process. That's what we're talking about here. This is not an over-the-weekend type thing where we go from planning to deployment. So it includes the plan, the STP. It also includes the service itself, which eventually gets put into deployment. And in our case, it may be implementing Get VPN. It includes any metrics and measurements. And this could involve, past case studies or documentation, projections for overhead of network bandwidth and on the network infrastructure, the service levels, which include service level agreements, and then really documenting all the processes and procedures as well as the service knowledge. What's the fundamental supporting documentation for this entire implementation? We're also going to make sure in service transition that it can be supported ultimately by the service operation itself. In other words, we're talking the talk, but are we ultimately going to be able to walk the walk with our actual real-world implementation? And again, as I started out with, this is a transition, but it could be into a whole new service. For example, implementing Dynamic Multipoint VPN or Get VPN from an IT security standpoint, or it could be actually the transition of implementing changes into production, changes to existing systems, changes to existing services. Just like if you own a restaurant and you're going to make changes to the menu or you're going to make improvements to the recipes, same type of thing here. And we accomplish this through some major management initiatives, through change management, through release and deployment management. It's all controlled through our asset and configuration management. What are some other goals and purposes? And it can depend upon, of course, whether this is a private venture or a public venture, whether it's government, whether it's military, whether it's the private sector, but there are some general guidelines, okay? One of the main goals is to develop a plan, STP, so planning and managing the actual build For example, if you're building out a SharePoint implementation, a deployment into operation, there's going to be this transitional phase, maybe from your existing intranet using Apache web servers or IIS into replacing it with Microsoft SharePoint. You'll build it, you'll test it, and you'll deploy it. Has to be well planned. You're providing a framework for transition. And the good thing about a framework is that a framework is extensible. It can be plugged in with new solutions. Just like IP security or public key infrastructure or 802.1x is a framework that supports lots of different protocols and algorithms and techniques and mechanisms. It's the same thing here for this particular phase of the life cycle. You're also going to maintain integrity of the assets. So you may involve a chain of custody as you introduce new assets or as you dispose of older assets and replace them. So you want to have that chain of custody going on that you may need later on. You want to establish in your framework a reusable, repeatable, modular process. You don't want to do this as a one-time project and not create these kind of modular, repeatable processes and procedures, because you're going to want to do this over and over again, and you're going to want to improve on it. And of course, that's the last phase, continual improvement. And the best way to get continual improvement is to make sure that these processes that you put in place are modular and well documented and repeatable. They can be repeated by you and your team. They can be repeated by people who come in after you and take your place. You want to set reasonable expectations, especially for the customer, whether the customer is inside your organization or whether it's the customer of a service provider. Again, a major goal is to enhance the ability to integrate not only new processes or new services, but to integrate change. Because integrating modifications is also involving a transition. You want to reduce any of the variables, any of the variations, any of the anomalies. You want to reduce errors and you want to minimize risk. And in the same time, you want to do that while maintaining and meeting all your requirements within all the constraints that you have, for example, budgetary constraints, personnel constraints, time constraints, and any mandates you have. Are you mandated by HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley or some other governance initiative? Before we dive into our next topic of service transition tools, I want to discuss an interesting aspect of service transition. That's the knowledge management aspect. The OGC has an interesting little model here where data leads to information, information leads to knowledge, knowledge leads to wisdom. Data is our individual, discrete set of facts. Most organizations are compiling these discrete facts on a daily basis. From those discrete factual nuggets, I might call them, you get your information. It's the information that actually puts that data, that raw data, into context. It gives relevance to the data or the set of facts. Then that information becomes knowledge. Knowledge is combined with the data to give us our experiences, our ideas, our focus, our scope, the insights, and the judgments of the team of experts, the IT team, the security team, the service desk, the help desk, management, the steering committees. Along with that knowledge involves a high degree of analysis to facilitate the overall decision-making process. And then we have what's called wisdom. This is the ultimate discernment. That's a combination of knowledge and experience to give us a strong common sense judgment. This corporate wisdom, this IT wisdom, will allow the organization to direct its strategy and its growth as competitively as possible and effectively and efficiently as possible. So we have the raw data, which becomes information, the who, the what, the when, the where. That information becomes the knowledge, which is the how, and then the wisdom is really the why. But without the knowledge, information, and data, we cannot get to the wisdom part and the understanding of why we're doing things, why we're offering services, why we're providing solutions that we're providing. Now, the tools that we're going to use, first of all, is the configuration management database. And this could be, MySQL or Microsoft SQL. It could be information stored in Active Directory. in a Windows 2008 environment, for example. It could be stored in public folders on Exchange or some other platform. It can be provided by, let's say, Microsoft SharePoint, which I've talked about so many times. This stores the configuration details, all the information for the IT infrastructure, global policies, group policies, user profiles, system policies, the configuration management database. And that CMDB is actually a core component of the CMS, the configuration management system. So the system is more of a logical component, whereas the CMDB is the actual database, where the data is actually stored on physical drives, where the data storage, data mining, reporting, analysis can be done. Then you have, of course, another tool being the Service Knowledge Management System. And we talked about this in the previous nugget. This is the complete set of all of the integrated components that are used to manage knowledge and information. The SKMS will include the configuration management system as well as other databases. It stores, it updates, it manages, it controls all the information that the service provider needs or that the service desk needs to manage the full life cycle of their services. The CMDB is the configuration management database. Talked about that. That's a main component of the configuration management system. And then we have what's known as the KEDB, which is typically optional, but this is the known error database. This is a database that's created by problem management or incident management, and it's basically used as a troubleshooting tool or part of the continuous improvement process to make sure that we don't repeat our errors and that we fix our mistakes. This next process, which is Service Asset and Configuration Management, is where we're really going to leverage that CMDB, that Configuration Management Database. And remember, the database is one or more integrated databases, relational databases that have information sources that offer that kind of logical infrastructure that supports our IT infrastructure. And it's going to capture and store the configuration items, CIs. Configuration items are basically any type of configurable object or component, any component that supports IT service. Now that wouldn't be individual people. People are not configuration items, but basically any other thing. An RFC, a request for change document, service level agreements, incident records, trouble tickets, asset management databases, all those things are CIs, configuration items. And the Service Asset and Configuration Management is going to provide IT service support by managing storage and data provision concerning these configuration items, as well as all the service assets that are leveraged and used throughout the service life cycle. So at the core of this, at the inside of this, is our management and planning. And then the activities that take place around this will be things like status accounting. Status accounting is the process of reporting all of the current data as well as historical data about each configuration item throughout its life cycle. So the status could be, in the test phase, it could be under development, it could be live, it could be disposed, things like that, the status of the configuration items. Status accounting also includes the configuration baseline. It'll also include any software versions, any versioning and updates. That's why SharePoint is such a valuable tool, because it has document libraries and versioning tools. It also is going to document the person responsible, the owner, the one who's responsible for the status change. It'll also have a history of configuration item changes, any incidents, any problems. And then based on this information, we're going to generate reports from this. And depending upon your software or your database solution, you can generate a wide variety of different types of reports. That's the output. And you're going to make decisions, and it'll facilitate the iterative process of going back and readdressing a lot of these issues. Verification and auditing. This is the periodic review and audit process to verify that you've got configuration items for all of your components, making sure that they're recorded and stored correctly in the database, that you've got conformity between your baselines and the actual environment that they're describing. And you should perform audits after a major change to the infrastructure. If you've recovered from a disaster, you should perform an audit, maybe in response to any unauthorized configuration items, and then of course at regular scheduled intervals, verification and auditing. Control is basically just the storage and modification of configuration data. This is the ongoing operation. Making sure that in this ongoing operation that only the authenticated and authorized users as well as valid configuration items are actually being recorded. And identification is just basically having some type of scheme, okay? Some type of scheme for classifying and identifying assets and configuration items. That could be some type of alphanumeric scheme that has mapping to a spreadsheet or a database, and that should be part of your database management system, is identifying uniquely all of your assets and configuration items. Also part of service transition is change management, and this is not a novel concept to you. This has been covered in pretty good detail in the existing ITIL series, being change management, which really focuses on a couple of constructs. Change is the biggest input to the CM database, the change management database, of course, and we're dealing here with the request for change, and we covered this in the existing series. And the goal of change management is to make sure that all the changes are efficiently controlled, they're done quickly through standardized procedures and methods. And the standardization can be either company-wide or industry-wide. It depends upon what area you're in. The financial industry, the healthcare industry, the retail industry, not-for-profit, government agencies, and so on. So we also want to reduce the negative impact of the change. We want to minimize it by making sure that we've got good service quality, and it should have a minimal impact on our day-to-day operations. Here's an interesting little quote here that we want to keep in mind. Not every change is improvement, but every improvement is a change. So keep that in mind. Change management also defines different types of changes. Okay, a normal change is any change that basically adheres to all of the processes and the steps of the change process. And this is going to be assessed by either a change manager, and that's a specific role that we talked about in the existing ITIL series, the change manager, or maybe you have some type of change advisory board, the normal changes. Then we have what are called standard changes. These are pre-approved. They're low risk, they're pretty common, and they follow a predefined set of steps or procedures. For example, resetting passwords, or leasing out or lending out laptops, or overhead projectors, things like that. You don't need a request for change to implement a standard change, but they are going to be logged and they're going to be tracked, and you'll use something like a service request, okay, on the standard. The emergency changes, these must be brought into place as soon as possible, like a security update, or an update to your antivirus system, or updating the signatures in your intrusion prevention system, maybe elevating your security from a DES encryption to AES encryption. And the change management process typically has a special process for handling these emergency changes. Some other terms to remember in change management. There's the RFC, the request for change. This is the standard form that we use to document and process all changes, and that's all, ALL, all changes to any configuration object or configuration item, CI. The PSO is a projected service outage. The projected service outage is going to lay out any changed targets or changed goals for agreed upon service level agreements, SLAs, and any service availability. Because why? Well, because changes have been implemented in addition to planned downtime. So there's a projected service outage due to this change being implemented. I already mentioned the CAB, the Change Advisory Board. Either the Change Manager or the Change Advisory Board should be dealing with your normal and standard changes. You may also have certain individuals who are set aside as the ECAB, kind of a subgroup of the Change Advisory Board that provide expert IT opinion and maybe even authorization for emergency changes. There are basically 8 steps of change management. First of all, we're going to log the request for change. The minute that it's placed, for example, into a SharePoint document library, and maybe it's going to trigger some type of workflow, that's going to be logged, either automatically logged in something like SharePoint or manually logged as a process. Okay, it kind of reminds me of the movie Office Space, where they're like, did you fill out your TPS report? Okay, so got to fill out that TPS report as soon as you're going to generate a request for change. There'll be an initial review of that change, and again, if this was a workflow process, it would automatically generate an email message to whoever the reviewer or the auditor is in this RFC process. And then, of course, once they're reviewing it, they'll assess the validity, perhaps assign a priority to it, perhaps they're going to verify if it's a necessary change, and then possibly modify or alter the workflow to send it to somebody else who has expertise in that area. It'll be ultimately authorized, most likely at the end of the workflow process, by a change manager or somebody on the Change Advisory Board, the CAB. If it's an emergency, then that's where that emergency CAB, the ECAB, comes in. It'll generate a work order. You'll coordinate any parallel tasks. Work orders coordinated. This is probably going to bring into place some project management and project managers. The change will be reviewed and possibly as an iterative process sent back again through the workflow, okay, where maybe you reassess and then reauthorize, because you may have to change the actual change process itself, and then finally, once the change has been completed and reviewed, then you'll close the change, and that'll pretty much finish up the workflow process. By the way, there's some really good books out there for workflow that you can use with something like SharePoint. If you go up and just go to your favorite bookseller online, I think there's a workflow in the 2007 Microsoft Office system. There's some SharePoint workflow books, so you might want to check that out. Here's something interesting that's been put out by the ITIL, and that's the 7 R's. The 7 R's of change management. This would be probably a good thing for you to memorize. Maybe get some flashcards going. And it's basically this of change management. Who raised the change? Okay? Who initiated the change? What is the reason or the purpose for the change? What is the return required from the change? What type of output is necessary? What is kind of the goal? And what are the risks of the change? What resources are necessary to deliver this particular change? Who's responsible? Okay, who's taking ownership for the build process, the testing, and deployment or integration of the change? And what is the relationship between this change and other changes? And this is the 7th R, but it's very important to know at all times what effect a change is going to have on other processes, other business units, other systems. And that's one of the main things about change management. One of the major goals is you want to reduce as much as possible any negative impact on any other area or system when you implement a change. So let's memorize these. Who raised, the reason, the return, the risks, the resources, who's responsible, and what is the relationship between this change and other changes. And are those other changes happening as part of the process in parallel, or are they unintentional changes that can be detrimental to our organization? If you're going to use something hypothetically like SharePoint, and you're going to build business processes or business logic through workflow processes and automated procedures, You want to know the key performance indicators of change management. You'll need these KPIs as performance metrics to be able to, during the transition process, analyze and observe the effects of these changes. And so here's some common key performance indicators, and these can be used to generate reports and other web-based output in something like SharePoint, for example, in an XML-based format, or maybe on your intranet. And this would be things like, what are the numbers of requests for change, the ones that are accepted, the ones that are rejected? What are the number of successful changes and the percentage of successful changes as a part of the whole? Evaluating the emergency changes, and why do you have so many emergency changes? That's a good question to ask. Having too many emergency changes could be a sign of poor implementation or things that have been missed in the design phase or the strategy phase. How many changes are waiting to be implemented? What is the backlog? And that kind of goes back down here to what is the change backlog? What are the bottlenecks that are existing right now? That's going to cut to productivity and efficiency, and it's going to really hurt constant improvement. What are the number of implemented changes? Okay, what is the business impact of these changes? And has it had its desired effect? And what are the frequency of configuration item changes? These are all good key performance indicators that should be part of the metrics and the ongoing analysis and reporting and database results from an ongoing change management infrastructure. Also part of the transition process is release and deployment management. Now, before I talk about the goal of release management, let's get some explanations here of, release and what we're talking about. A release, a group or a collection of authorized changes to an IT service. This could be a corporate-wide service pack upgrade to a client-side operating system. Let's say going from a different version of XP or an upgrade to Vista, for example. An upgrade to Microsoft Office, for example. So it's a collection or a group. Then you have what's called a release unit. This is a portion of a service of IT infrastructure that's typically released together based on the organization's release policy. And this unit can be, all over the place. It could be a type or an item of a service asset. For example, adding some modular component to a security appliance or a router. It can be a service component. Beyond hardware, it could be software. It could be going to a new version of Microsoft Exchange, for example. That's a particular unit. Then you have what's called a release package. I'm just going to put PKG here, a release package. This can be a single release unit, could be a package, or it could be a structured set of release units, again, like the entire Microsoft Office suite. So the goal of release and deployment management is to deploy all new releases into the production environment and provide transitional support to the service operation, which is the stage that comes next. Okay, transition leads to service operation, and it's here to allow for the effective use of these processes to deliver value to the customer or to the bottom line. Some other components of this release and deployment management is the DML, the Definitive Media Library. This used to be called the DSL. Okay, we call it the DML now. This is the secure library where the definitive authorized versions of all of your media configuration objects are stored and protected. So for example, this could be an Active Directory with a Kerberos security system. This should include all of your licensed software, all of your documentation, all of your PDF files, any in-house developed software, okay, code, intellectual property, the Definitive Media Library. Then you have what are called Definitive Spares, DS. This used to be called DHS, but we call it Definitive Spares now. And this is physical storage of all spare IT components, spare modules that might go into a router, spare hard drives, spare USB drives, definitive spares. Now, there are several different kind of architectures or options for release deployment. Okay, there's the Big Bang approach, which you've got a new service or a change service, and it's basically deployed in a big bang fashion to all the users in one operation. So users leave on Friday at 5 o'clock, they come back on Monday, and they suddenly have a upgraded operating system or a new version of productivity software, things like that. Maybe even a new hardware implementation. Maybe they leave on Friday, they have analog phones, they come back on Monday, they've got IT, they've got voice over IP Cisco phones in their cubicles. The Big Bang approach. Obviously, that's going to get the quickest application change and consistency across the board, but the downside is you're going to increase the risk and the impact of a failed release because it's going to be a global failure, and that could have some problems. So that's one approach, the Big Bang approach. You may also release and deploy in a phased approach, which is very popular. Okay, you start out with a particular subset of the user base, most likely your power users or your advanced users. You roll it out to them, they use it, and then you continue to roll out subsequent parts to different parts of the user base on a scheduled rollout plan, either department by department, or you can isolate certain types of power users across different departments and business units, roll it out to them first and then to other users. For example, you're in a retail environment where you're rolling out a new point of sale system, and maybe certain stores only or certain departments only are going to get that new point of sale system. There's the push approach, where the service components deployed from the center of the organization and pushed out to target locations. You could think of this as deploying something, let's say in an insurance company, at the headquarters, and then rolling it out. Let's say if it's State Farm Insurance, you would roll it out at the headquarters in Indiana or Iowa or wherever they are, and then you would roll it out to all of the agents across North America, that kind of thing. There's the pull approach. This is typically used with software, and it can be either automated or manual, where you're going to be pulling software releases whenever the software is made available at the central location, but then the users can pull that software to their own branch office or remote office or their own department at a time of their choosing or when they actually need it. So you can see this in Microsoft. Their operating system can actually publish something to their systems, but it doesn't actually get installed until they actually go to use that particular software. And once they double click on the icon, it invokes a process of pulling that software and installing it down to their system at the time of use. And this can also be done with things like VPN clients and those types of security tools. And they can be automated or manual. Big Bang, phased approach, push approach, pull approach. Some of the major activities of release and deployment management, and you could pretty much put these in order, where of course you're developing your release policy and you're going through in-depth planning. You're going to define the contents of the release, put together some type of schedule, set aside the resources needed, the roles and responsibilities of the participants, the users in the organization for deploying this particular software upgrade, for example. Then of course you'll go through the design phase and the pilot testing. You should always try to roll out something in a prototypical environment before you roll it out enterprise-wide. So you can test out your scripts, you can run testing procedures, you can have rollback processes that you're going to go through. What do you do if you roll it out in a certain area and you don't like the results? Can you roll back to a certain state, system state? That's part of that design and test as well. You'll also want to make sure that you have well-documented installation procedures, and that in the testing process you are following those procedures and then tweaking them and getting them just right, very understandable for the end user. Then you've got the actual rollout plan. You're going to define your timetable, identify any affected configuration items, how you're going to communicate and train your end users, awareness training, support staff, that includes the service desk and help desk. then logistics. This is the, getting the financial assets that you need, actually going out and acquiring and purchasing the hardware and the software and dealing with product managers. This also includes, decommissioning or disposing of older software and older hardware and following the policy for disposition, removing redundancies in your assets and your organization. Then you go through the actual distribution of the hardware or the software, and that can be either automated or manual, especially from a software standpoint. It can be automated, it can be push or pull, and then ultimately the actual installation process itself. As we saw, the final stage is really the service validation, validating the service and testing it to make sure that the end result of the change is as close to being what we planned as possible. So we're making sure that the new service or the change service is going to deliver the proper value to our business and to our customers. We want to provide a high degree of confidence that the changes that were delivered deliver the planned outcome, and it needs to be within all of the costs, the capacity that we have, and any constraints that were in place. So not only do we want the service to be validated as performing within the parameters that we planned, but that we didn't have any cost overruns, any capacity overruns, those types of things. And all of this is going to work together. Validation and testing is going to be a huge contributor to overall quality assurance. The testing, the proper testing of this release and deployment under the umbrella of change management is to reduce the number of incidents, to reduce the number of service desk calls and trouble tickets, to reduce problems and errors, to lower cost, to lower the total cost of ownership, and to isolate and identify any ineffective services. And I didn't really spell this right, but this should be ineffective services. Service validation and testing. As we finish up this update nugget, I want to assign you a little bit of a homework project. I'd like you to go do some more research on your own time into the service transition V model. And this relates to validation and testing, and this will probably come up on your exam. And we want to understand this concept where you're defining the appropriate and necessary requirements and the right validation methods to justify to the customer the release of a change or an update or a deployment. So over here on the left-hand side, you can see we've got specifications where we're defining customer requirements, defining service requirements, service solution, service design. This is service release, design and service release, and the solution. So over here on the left, this is the specifications of kind of the high-level business requirements. And this is going to get refined into more granular details of service design criteria and actually resulting in the individual release package criteria. Over here on the right-hand side, we have the validation. And this is the validation activities, the test activities. You can see a whole bunch of tests here: component and assembly, service release package, service operational readiness, service acceptance test, where we are testing and validating the activities that are performed against the things that we've specified, the specifications over here on the left-hand side. So you can see there's a horizontal relationship as well with different types of plans between the specifications and the validation on the right-hand side. And so the goal here is to develop and perform a top-down approach from a design standpoint, but when testing, you're typically going to start from the bottom and move up. And of course, you can go up and just use your favorite search engine and do some more research on the Service Transition V model. I want to recommend that you do that as kind of an extra bonus assignment before you go in to take your exam. But take a look at this and perhaps get out a piece of paper and document this on your own and use this as a study guide. In this nugget on service transition, we first looked at an overview and the purpose and goals and objectives of service transition, of course, as it leads to service operation, which is going to be our next nugget. Looked at some tools of service transition, the service asset and configuration management aspect, revisited change management, talked about release and deployment management, and then finished up with service validation and testing. Along with that, I showed you the Service V model. I hope this CBT nugget's been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in the next nugget on service operation.